All right, looks like we have everybody here today. So again, I'm Dan Malone with Reaching Higher New Hampshire. Thank you for joining us this morning to talk about education funding in our state. I'm joined by Evelyn, our Executive Director, and Caitlin, Director of School Finance for the State Department of Education. So we're going to kick things off in a second and walk through the agenda. I just wanted to note that if you have any issues with the technical functioning of the webinar, if you can't hear us at any point, please use the question and answer function to send us a message and we'll try and make sure that we can get connected with you. So with that, I'm going to turn it over to Evelyn.
Welcome and thank you all for joining us today. I'm Evelyn Asa, the Executive Director of Reaching Higher New Hampshire. Reaching Higher is a Concord-based, nonpartisan nonprofit focused on public education policy. We are a policy resource for New Hampshire families, educators, and lawmakers. Our mission is to support high-quality public education for every student in New Hampshire. We provide policy analysis and support with the aim of elevating public awareness of innovations underway in our schools and building support for high standards in all our classrooms. We're delighted to be here with you all today. We have a lot of material to cover, so we're going to jump right in. My colleague Dan Malone is Reaching Higher's Director of Engagement. He's joined by Caitlin Davis, Internal Auditor at the New Hampshire Department of Education. Today, Dan and Caitlin are going to provide you with an overview of how New Hampshire education funding works, discuss how New Hampshire arrived at the current funding formula and process, touch on relevant legislation, and highlight education investments in the governor's proposed budget. A quick note that in the coming days, we'll be doing a webinar exclusively on the governor's budget proposal. We'll offer that as soon as appropriations legislation is made available to the public. With that, I'm going to turn it over to Dan and Caitlin. Thanks again for being with us today.
Hi, everybody. So real quickly on a technical aspect, you should have a screen in front of you that allows you to communicate with us. There's three options. There's a chat feature, which I don't think we'll have any need for today. The raise hand feature, that basically just sends a signal to us from your computer. Again, I don't think that we would need that today. And then you have a submit questions feature, and we encourage you to submit questions at any point during the webinar. We're going to hold off on answering them until the end, but anytime you enter a question, it gets stored in our database so we can go down the list at the end and try and make sure we address all of your questions. So with that, we like to start by highlighting New Hampshire's Constitution, Part 2, Article 83. This is where it says that the state has a constitutional duty to provide an education and support public schools. This is basically the foundation for public education in our state and the basis upon which we have formed our funding and resource allocation systems. So how does the state meet that constitutional obligation? So first we start by looking at the State Department of Education budget. This is from fiscal year 2017, the fiscal year that we are in right now. And you'll immediately see that overwhelmingly the majority of funds from the state in support of public education consist of what is called adequate education grants. This is money that goes from the state down to schools to provide for an adequate education for students. We're going to talk about this more in depth later, but you'll note that we kind of carved out a section of the adequate education funds to indicate that actually about a third of those funds consist of statewide education property tax funds. Those are actually local funds that stay in the locality to support their local schools. Just quickly, you'll notice that the second largest category of funds that come from the State Department of Education consists of federal funds. These are going in support of specific endeavors such as Title I funds to support schools serving high populations of students from low-income families. The state also supports or provides grants for some specific initiatives like building aid or catastrophic aid, which is aid that goes to support students who require a specific special education set of services that are unusually or above average cost. And then finally, there's another category which consists of a number of smaller initiatives like career school licensing and credentialing. I'm going to turn things over to Caitlin now to talk a little bit more about adequate education grants.
So the adequate education grants, those are what we're talking about when we talk about the constitutional requirement to provide an adequate education. So when that lawsuit went through, the Department of the legislature said that the court said that the legislature must cost out an adequate education and provide funding to the school districts to provide that adequate education. So that adequate education, the funds specifically were put into the Education Trust Fund and are provided in grants to towns and cities across the state. The Education Trust Fund right here, this is where you can see we will go over the revenue sources of the Education Trust Fund in a little bit, but you can see 96% of the funding goes directly to municipalities, and the remaining 4% of it goes to charter schools to provide adequate education.
Just quickly on this slide, we also wanted to note that there's a couple legislative bills this session that deal with this. Specifically on this slide, we carved out HB 505, which actually was just retained in committee this week. So that bill is not going to be acted upon this year. But HB 584 is continuing its way through the legislature, and HB 584 would change how the state funds charter schools. Essentially, it would tie charter school funding to the average cost per pupil for the state. So that would have a significant difference on how charter schools are funded. We'll actually talk about that at the end of the webinar when we discuss the governor's budget proposals.
So the adequacy formula is in law. It's 198.38. And in law, it pretty much prescribes two parts of an adequate education funding formula. There's the preliminary cost, which is made of factors we'll go over in a little bit, plus the stabilization grant, which is an amount that is also in law, based on some changes on the formula. Again, over. And then that equals the total adequate education grant. So that is the amount that we see as total cost of adequate education across the board in New Hampshire.
So here we're showing the adequacy funding formula, the initial formula that was established in 2008 for how to calculate the universal cost of providing an adequate education for a student in New Hampshire. So basically there was a committee that was formed to study how to fund adequate education. And they arrived at a formula that basically said the universal cost to educate one student is $3,450. This slide shows how those dollars are distributed. And so it basically shows that 47.7% of that $3,450 is to go to a teacher's salary. So a couple of things that we wanted to note on this slide. So first, when this commission set this formula in 2008, they made a set of assumptions about what the costs are for various inputs into an education. So for example, for a teacher, they assume that the average cost for a salary would be that of a teacher with 3 years of experience and a bachelor's degree. And that's about $36,000. Unfortunately, they chose to use benchmarks that are very low. So in 2008, the actual average salary for a teacher in New Hampshire was closer to $48,000. So you can see that right off the bat, the adequacy funding formula established a very low benchmark for what the state would support with respect to education. In addition to that, they also made assumptions about class sizes. And so in adequacy, the student-to-teacher ratio is between 25 and 30 students for every teacher. Again, that does not necessarily correspond with what the average class sizes were or are across New Hampshire. And then finally, I'd note that if you look at what this slide shows, there's a couple things missing. So there's no school nurse, there's no funding for the superintendent or central office that is necessary for supporting a school. And there's also a fairly small amount of money being sent to things like technology, which we know how expensive and important that is today. So this slide just underscores the fact that when they established the adequacy funding formula in 2008, they made a set of assumptions that we might think need to be revisited based upon what we now know schools are actually spending to support students.
So that base amount, the $34.50, it's actually in law that amount is adjusted by the Consumer Price Index every biennium, so every 2 years. And it's adjusted by week. It's adjusted by the average of the last 3 years of the Consumer Price Index, less health insurance costs, which is just an important thing to know. So over the last few years, there's been a 1.8% and then up to almost a 2% increase in that amount each year. So in 2016, that $34.50, which is the universal cost for every single student, is now $3,561.27 per kid. So in the adequacy formula, there are a bunch of there's a few different things called differentiating. So we have the base amount per student, the $33,561, and then there's a few other factors. So if a student is eligible for free or reduced lunch, we say that we'll give the school some more money. Additionally, if they are an English language learner, special education eligible, or test below proficient on the 3rd grade reading test, that's in Smarter Balance, you are eligible for some additional aid. So all of these aid factors are added up to make an amount per student. So what we do is we take these amounts and we multiply it by the average daily membership in attendance, and that essentially equals the average cost for the actual cost of adequate education.
And I would just note that average daily membership in attendance is not exactly equivalent to enrollment, but we should consider it today basically the students in the school. So if you want to think about it as just membership in a school or attendance, it's fairly close to that, although there's a specific calculation for every school.
And for the purpose of kindergarten, an average daily membership. So if a kindergartner is attending a class, attending full day, a kindergartner only counts as half for this. And this is just kind of important to note because the state of New Hampshire only funds half-day kindergarten right now through the current funding formula, whether a local district has chosen to adopt full-day kindergarten or not.
So what this slide shows is basically the breakdown for 4 example communities of what their adequacy costs look like. So if we look at Berlin, for example, their ADMA for the base cost is $1,073. So we can think that there's about 1,000 students in Berlin. Of those 1,000 students, over half, or 56%, are eligible for free and reduced price lunch. Just under 0.5% are English language learners. Right around 20% are special education students, and then about 1% are eligible for the grade 3 reading aid. If you look at Londonderry, those figures look very different. The percentages of students who are free and reduced price lunch eligible is very low. What this slide is showing is that this way the state funding works, it gives the same per pupil aid to a school irrespective of that school's proportion of students. So this is important because we know that higher concentrations of poverty correlate with a larger demand of specific services. It is a much more complex endeavor to serve higher populations of students who come from, who experience poverty at home or are suffering from any number of situations like housing instability, food instability, or exposure to toxic stress in any other way. The state funding formula currently does not really take that into consideration when it gives its grants down to school. It simply looks at the number of students and does a per pupil basis. So Londonderry receives the same amount of free and reduced price lunch aid per pupil that Berlin does, even though Berlin is serving a school population where over half the students come from a relatively low income family.
So once we've come up to the cost of an adequate education, the next thing the Department of Education does is we look at something called the statewide education property tax. So the statewide education property tax is an amount that's determined in law. It's $363 million that must be raised across the state of New Hampshire from the local municipalities to pay for education. So the Department of Revenue calculates this amount based on equalized valuations in the town, so the amount that the properties are worth, and the Department of Revenue then tells the Department of Education how much each town and city has raised. We then say, all right, here's the cost of an adequate education, and here's how much you raised through the statewide education property tax alone. Now, this is the amount that we owe this town after that local property tax is netted against that cost of an adequate education. A few things that's important to point out here. So the statewide education property tax, in some instances, may be more than the cost of an adequate education in that town alone. So that amount is raised locally and kept locally by each town or city, that statewide education property tax. It's never remitted back to the state of New Hampshire. So if you raise more than that, you as the town get to keep that extra amount and can use it for your education system. There's no requirement to give that extra amount back to the state of New Hampshire. So this is where people kind of get confused that there's donor towns. So there is no such thing as a donor town, because if you raise more than the cost of an adequate education through your statewide education property tax alone, you get to keep that extra amount as the town or city.
And so an interesting question is, where did the $363 million, where did that figure come from? And basically, it is a bit of an accounting effort, because there's not a specific purpose why 363 is what it is. It was basically that the state needed to raise a total amount of money, and 363 kind of made up the difference between what the adequacy calculation led to. So it's not specifically tied to some magic set of services that the state believes needs to be provided, but rather it is a function of counting.
So the next part is the stabilization grant. The stabilization grant is essentially we could refer to as a hold harmless grant that's inadequacy. So in 2011, 2012, if you remember, this formula is in law. There was a different formula that was in law, and there were some substantial changes that were made to that formula. Most notably, there was an amount called the Fiscal Capacity Disparity Aid, which provided funding to towns based on the equalized valuation in their town and the median family income. And it ranked towns and cities into octiles, so into groups of 8, and the lowest two groups received $1,250 and $2,000 more per kid in that town for ADM. So across the board, the total number of ADMs, the total number of kids that were in those octiles, was about $50 million across the state. So that amount, the Fiscal Capacity Disparity Aid, was removed from the formula. And then there was an additional amount in the formula. And if you remember, we were talking about the free and reduced lunch funding back in the differentiated aid. It worked a little differently. So right now, every single kid that qualifies gets a base amount. But previously, the amounts were weighted. So the higher percentage of free and reduced lunch in your community, you received a higher amount for every single kid, regardless of if that specific kid was free and reduced lunch or not. So that across the board, that changed by changing it to the same amount for every single kid, no matter what community they were in, related to about $100 million of changes in the formula. So those two things together, $150 million, was stripped out of the formula in 2011 to 2012. Well, when this formula was being put into place, people realized that change couldn't happen as drastically as it was going to happen from one year to the next. Some of these towns are going to be losing millions of dollars. And so the stabilization grant was determined. So the stabilization grant, all it did was it looked at what you were going to get under the old formula in 2011, and then looked at what you were going to get under the new formula in 2012, and figured out what that difference was. That difference became the stabilization grant. So one thing that's important to note about that, so there was no provision in law for that amount, that stabilization grant, to change. So if all of a sudden you became a very poor town you were not going to get a stabilization grant if the difference from 2013 to 2012 was an issue. It was only that 1 year. So in 2016, there was a change in HB2 in the budget bill that now is starting to decrease the stabilization grant each year by 4%. So remember, so stabilization has nothing to do with enrollments, and it has nothing to do with the actual formula now. It's just a set amount. So every single town or city that has a stabilization grant is now being reduced by 4% a year. And this 4% reduction is going to go on for the next 25 years. 2017 was the very first year of this reduction. And what is important to note, it's 4% of the original stabilization grant, the $158 million. And that amount, so in 2017 is reduced by 4%. 2018, it's going to be reduced by 8%, the original amount. 2019, 12%, just to kind of let you know how that works.
And so I just want to underscore that this is a really important slide to look at, because basically from 2008 to 2011, the state provided a substantial amount of targeted aid. This fiscal capacity, disparity aid, and how it calculated free and reduced price lunch aid both meant that a lot of money was going to communities that have a low property tax base and that are serving higher populations of students who are eligible for free and reduced price lunch. So that's very targeted aid. The change in 2011 got rid of all of that targeted aid and essentially created this new stabilization grant and put all of that money, the $150 million, into these stabilization grants. Now that those grants are going away, they are most impactful on these poor communities. So Franklin is losing $160,000 a year. That's the equivalent of 3 teaching positions in that one community. And that's happening across the state as the stabilization grants continue to decline. And so we want to underscore that point with this slide by showing 4 different communities. And so what this slide shows, just briefly, is basically the total adequacy grants that these 4 communities are receiving, broken down by the SWEPT amount, and the stabilization grant, and then the total grant. So I would just draw your attention to show that, again, looking at Berlin, the stabilization grant for that community is over half of the total state funding for education. If you contrast that with a community such as Bedford, which because of both what the school system looked like in 2011 and its property tax base and other demographic features, it does not receive a stabilization grant. So the decline in stabilization grants has no impact on Bedford. Nashua, you kind of see, is an interesting another example where you have a large amount of SWEPT, you have a large amount of stabilization grant that is going away, and a relatively large adequacy funding grant in total. On the left side of the slide, we just are calling your attention to some of the legislation that could have an impact on adequacy funding that's still moving through the process this year. The one that I draw your attention to is SB 191. This would change the calculation of average daily membership and attendance to provide full-day kindergarten for those communities that offer it. So that would adjust, as Caitlin mentioned before, currently kindergarten students are counted as 1/2, irrespective of whether they attend half-day or full-day kindergarten. This bill would make the adjustment to count them as full students if they are doing a full-day K program. So with this slide, we just want to provide a brief history of how this funding formula has changed since 2008. And so if you look back, starting at the upper left part of the slide, you see that's when the legislature created a commission that then formed the current adequacy funding formula. And that included the fiscal capacity disparity aid, and it provided that differentiated aid based upon the proportion of students eligible for free and reduced price lunch. As we mentioned, in 2011, the legislature changed the funding formula, removed that targeted aid, and established a stabilization grant. They also put a cap on adequacy grants, basically saying that communities could only receive so much more over the increase over a year could only be so much, about 105% basically. So it limited, even if your enrollment increased substantially, your adequacy grant was capped at about 105% of what you received the previous year. In 2012, they essentially put in a hold harmless grant that said communities would receive at minimum a 95% of what the state calculated to be their initial estimate. 2013, they increased the cap from 105 to 108%. 2015 was when the legislature passed a law to start the phase out of the stabilization grants. Initially, when that bill was proposed, there was actually some very large drops envisioned. So at one point in time, they envisioned almost scrapping stabilization grants very quickly. And then they arrived at a plan to phase it out over 25 years. In 2016, we had the Dover lawsuit, which essentially meant that that cap, the 108% cap, was declared to be, in essence, unconstitutional. And so that means that communities such as Dover, Bedford, Windham, which have seen large enrollment growth, are going to receive much more adequacy funding as a result of this lawsuit.
So how does the state pay for all of this? So as you mentioned, the Education Trust Fund, when we saw it in that original slide where we had the charter schools and the district schools, is almost $1 billion a year. It's actually the single largest line item in the state of New Hampshire budget. So there's a couple of different ways we pay for that money. The statewide education property tax, SWEP, is a large portion of that. That's at $363 million that we talked about before, that's netted against your cost of an adequate education. There's also, very notably, 8% of this is lottery funds. So as we know, the lottery funds education, but people are often very confused because they want to know where the check from the lottery is going to their school. Well, it's actually a revenue source of the Education Trust Fund, as well as many other things. So 17% of the Education Trust Fund is made up of business enterprise tax, also a small percentage of the rooms and meals tax. And then at the end of the year, if there is not enough revenue that is raised by these designated revenue sources, then a transfer from the State of New Hampshire General Fund is done into the Education Trust Fund to kind of cover these remaining amounts. So it's not like there's just a ton of money that's sitting in this Education Trust Fund waiting each year. There is actually usually always a deficit, so funds from the General Fund must be added to the Education Trust Fund every single year.
So this slide, we wanted to break down some very confusing terminology and figures that people often see when we talk about education. So first, we wanted to talk about adequacy versus cost per pupil. So again, adequacy is based on your average daily membership and attendance, or ADMA. And so the universal cost per student in adequacy looks at $3,561. If you added in all of the differentiated aid that adequacy includes, that's free and reduced price lunch, special education students, English language learners, and grade 3 reading, if you added in all of that aid, then kind of the average amount of adequacy funding that the state provides per student is around $5,482. Now, if you look at what the state is spending as a whole, and I mean what school districts across New Hampshire are spending, if you took all of the operating expenses across the state and divided them by the number of students in the state, you would see that we're spending $14,902, and that's, I think, school year 15-16. So about $15,000 per pupil. Now, this is where it gets a little tricky because education costs come in 3 different forms. So first, we have fixed costs. Think of a school building. Whether that school is serving 100 students, 95 students, 60 students, if the building, it's the size of the building and its maintenance costs, those are going to be the same thing. So there's very little correlation between the cost of maintaining a building and the number of students in that building. So that we can think of that as a fixed cost. Then you have batch costs. And by batch costs, we mean that, think of a teacher, for example. A teacher, according to the adequacy formula, should educate up to 30 students. So every 30 students, we can think of costing one teacher. But what that also means is that a school has to support a teacher, even if that teacher is teaching 30 students, 25 students, 20 students, 18 students. So regardless of whether it's 18 students or 30 students in the class, that school is going to support that teacher no matter what. And then finally, we have truly marginal costs for students. And so marginal cost means the incremental cost that a school system must provide to support one student. So think of a student that shows up brand new on day one of the school year. What are the additional costs that a school has to undertake to educate that student? This number is actually relatively small. If we assume that the student does not require any sort of special education or English language services, really the school is only going to be purchasing the incremental amount of books or papers or materials that that student needs. They've already paid for the building, they've already paid for teachers, they've already paid for buses, food, everything is already set. So it's actually a very small amount that that student needs. It's important to think about these different kinds of costs because as New Hampshire's enrollment declines, schools are increasingly being put in very financially vulnerable positions. Because as we'll see actually with this slide, education costs are increasing even as enrollment declines. And so what there's a lot going on this slide, so very briefly, you'll notice there are three lines. There's a blue line down at the bottom. That shows New Hampshire's public school enrollment over time, from 2008 to 2016. There's an orange line that shows the total adequacy funding from the state down to schools. That hovers right around $900 million, give or take, over the last 8 years. And then there's a yellow line that shows the total education spending across the state. As you can see, that goes up from around $2 billion towards $2.5 billion in 2016. Those lines correspond with the left axis. Then we have a blue bar and a gray bar. The blue bar shows the adequacy funding per student, and it corresponds with the right axis. So you can see that the adequacy funding per student has hovered right around $4,500 per student. The gray bar shows average cost per pupil over time. And so as you can see, that's increasing. And so what this slide shows, there's two big takeaways. The first is that enrollment is declining and costs are increasing, which means that our average cost per pupil is going to increase. This is, again, because we have to remember that costs are increasing with inflation. And also, even as schools lose between 5 or 6 students a year, they're not really reducing any of their expenditures. Because the enrollment is being diminished so slowly and incrementally, there's no way for schools to really achieve massive cost savings. And so their own costs continue to increase with inflation. The second is that what this means is that the state aid is essentially flat, even as education costs increase. And so that means that it's local property taxes that are making up the difference. So this slide shows us that if you're a property poor town, you're facing some very serious fiscal challenges because the state is providing the same flat amount even as your costs increase. And so towns like Claremont or Franklin are in the position where either they raise taxes on a very low tax base or they have to make some very drastic cuts in order to maintain their schools. So this slide, we just wanted to very briefly cover some of the initiatives mentioned in the governor's budget proposal that impact education. As Evelyn mentioned kind of earlier on, we're going to do a deep dive on this, so we're not going to go too in-depth right now. I'd also note that the governor proposes a budget, but then the state legislature actually has to act on appropriations legislation. So HB 1, HB 2 are moving through the process right now. Those will actually be the budget when they're finally approved and signed into law. But very briefly, there are four main things the governor mentioned in his budget proposal. First, targeted funds for full-day kindergarten. So basically, the governor proposed spending $9 million a year for the next 2 years to provide targeted support for full-day kindergarten. It's not clear exactly how that targeting will work, but I think the general idea is to target funds based upon communities' property wealth, the percentage of students who are free and reduced price lunch eligible, and percentage of students who are English language learners. Just as a note, the calculated cost to support full-day kindergarten across the state is around $15 million a year. So there is a gap between what the governor proposed and what would cover everyone across the state, and so that's why they're thinking of targeting it to communities. The next thing is enhanced charter school funding. So the governor talked about increasing charter school aid by tying it to the average cost per pupil in the state. So right now, charter schools receive the adequacy funding, and then they get a per pupil grant of around $3,000 for a charter school student. This change the governor would propose this to instead tie charter school aid to the average cost per pupil, and it would increase the overall impact would be about increasing the aid to around $8,000, $9,000 per student in a charter school. So a fairly significant increase in the amount of aid that goes to charter schools, and it would tie it to the average cost per pupil, so it would increase over time. The third program is the governor has a $5 million scholarship program, which would go to students to support basically higher education or post-secondary endeavors with a lot more discretion to the student on how that money is spent. And then school building aid. So this is where there's going to be probably a lot more discussion, because basically the school building aid, if you look in the budget proposal, it's only covering existing costs. So there's no increase in the line item for school building aid, but the governor proposed this infrastructure fund which could support projects that would involve school infrastructure. So it's not clear exactly how and what that means, but it is envisioned by the governor that there would be additional funding to support education infrastructure across the state. So just real quickly before we close up for questions, we want to note that there are some places you can go to learn more about what we talked about today. In particular, the State Department of Education has some great sites where you can really look and compare schools and districts and kind of communities across the state, both with respect to demographics and financing. Reaching Higher in New Hampshire, we provide a lot of resources, policy briefs, information. We also track education legislation, so we'd encourage everybody to follow that as we continue through the session. And now we'll move on to the Q&A section. We also want to provide our email, so at any time, any point in time, you can always send us individual emails for follow-up. So great, so now let's look at the Q&A. Sorry. Okay. So first. So we have a question about the charter school legislation. And so, Caitlin will take care of that.
So in 2018, to the first year of the proposed budget, charter schools will receive, I believe it's around $6,500 per kid. So in current law, charter schools receive that base amount, the $3,450, adjusted for CPI, plus an additional charter school tuition, charter school grant, and that amount is the $3,500. So that's $6,500. So that's what's in current law, plus the differentiated aid. If you remember a few slides ago where we talked about the average cost per pupil, so the governor's budget will actually tie it to that average cost per pupil that we spoke about. And I believe in the first year of the budget, it ends up being 48.5% of the average cost per pupil and increases slightly each year to then 50% in year 2 of the budget, 52% in 20, 54% of the average cost per pupil in 2021, and every year thereafter. So that's what that amount would be. It's tough to really target that exact amount that it would end up being, because if you remember, the average cost per pupil across the state is controlled locally, so that number, it does change each year.
So we have a question about legislation that repealed the cap. What happened to towns who had been protected from losing funds by retaining previously funded student populations? Was that safety net removed? So it's a great question. And so the way that adequacy funding used to be calculated, this is back in 2008, was the state would use enrollment data from 3 years prior. So even if you had substantial declines in enrollment, you kind of knew how much money you were going to get. The data was very solid. A couple years ago, the legislature changed that, so the state now has to use the 1 year back, the data from 1 year back to calculate adequacy. So they provide an estimate in November that says, here's what we think you're going to get for adequacy, and then they revise it over time based as the school provides more accurate information. There is a hold harmless provision that says a school will get at least 95% of that initial estimate, but that's the only safety net.
Right, and that estimate is done in November of every single year, and then you get your adequacy funds beginning in October of the next year. So it's 95% of that estimate, and when the Department of Education does that estimate, we actually do it based on a count that's in that year. So the estimate for the most part is pretty close.
So question, we are going to be posting this presentation, and we're recording this webinar, so we're going to post it online as soon as we can, and it might take a couple days for the technical fix, but it'll be up on Reaching Higher's website as soon as we can. So there's a question about how the adequacy is adjusted by inflation every 2 years. So the question is, every 2 years, it sounds like the adequacy amount will be adjusted by inflation, which is correct. Mm-hmm. And does that mean that the per pupil amounts are only being adjusted for 1/2 the real rate of inflation because it takes every 2 years?
So when we adjust it, we actually adjust it by the average of the last 3 years. So I guess in theory, I have to probably look at that question a little bit more, though.
It's a great question, and we can happily follow up. But it does. I mean, I think the state tries to make it tied to inflation, but again, the inflation index that the state uses does not take into consideration healthcare.
Right. So it's actually, but I just want to. It's consumer price index, which is actually very different than the inflation.
Right. True.
Yes.
Yes. How many towns, cities have stabilization grants? So that's a great question. We'll have to get back to you on the exact number. It is a substantial number of communities, but as Caitlin mentioned, it was created in 2012 and then never updated. So there are some communities that we might think would be eligible for a stabilization grant that don't receive some, and there are some more affluent communities that actually receive a stabilization grant because they were, for whatever reason, maybe perhaps less affluent in 2012. But we can find out and we can share the number of communities with stabilization grant. Where does the additional money outside of SWEPT come from? So outside of SWEPT, that was the slide that Caitlin talked through. This is where this shows all the sources of funds for the state to support adequate education. So you can see SWEPT is 41%, but then it's the lottery, it's the business enterprise tax, meals and room tax. Those are the sources of funds for the state to provide adequate education investments. So question, charter schools, do they get things like special education if a student qualifies? Yes. So,
well, special education is a little confusing. Right. So let's just talk about free and reduced lunch, for example. So if a charter school kid is free and reduced lunch, the charter school does get the free and reduced lunch portion of the funding. The special education portion is a little bit tricky because the way that special education funding and services work for charter schools is that the local resident district has the financial responsibility of providing special education services. This is done through a myriad of ways, including a charter school paying initially for the expenses and then the district reimbursing them, the charter school sending the kid to the district school to receive the special education services, a district sending a special education teacher to the charter school. So because of that, in law, the differentiated aid associated with the charter school kid actually goes to the local resident district, as the local resident district is the one that is responsible for paying for all of those special education costs.
Yeah, it's a great point. And New Hampshire is a bit unusual in how that functions between traditional public schools and charter schools. So next question is, so clarifying, adequacy has remained flat for traditional public schools with loss of stabilization. The governor proposes to tie charter school funding. Right, so there's a question basically, where is the extra money going to come to support the governor's proposal for charter schools? It would increase the amount of money that would go from the state to charter schools. And so that would be an additional expense to the education trust fund. So as Caitlin mentioned, there are dedicated revenue sources that I have on the slide right now. If those amounts don't equal what the state has to provide, then it will come from the general fund. So the additional $15 million for charter schools, if it increases, the cost overall could come from the general funding. There's also a question about federal funding. So we didn't talk about federal funding too much. It's actually fairly complex, and we're happy. If people think that they would like to learn more about federal funding, we're going to send a poll out in a second. Let us know, because we'd be happy to dive into that. But there's a lot of different kinds of federal funds, and how they get distributed down to schools is different for different funding streams. So there's a question, do charter schools get building aid?
So as of today, charter schools have not received any building aid. But remember, with building aid, there's been a moratorium on building aid for 8 years now. So that means there has been no new projects in the state of New Hampshire that have been funded for charter schools or district public schools across the board. So if the state of New Hampshire were to start providing building aid for new projects again, charter schools would be eligible to apply to the state of New Hampshire Education Department for building aid funds. But there's a lot of big ifs in there. How much money is going to be available based on the weighted factors and things like that. So it's really just if there's building aid funding, yes, a charter school is absolutely capable and welcome to apply.
So the question, the funding model doesn't seem viable. Is anyone considering changing it? And the answer is, so HB 356, a bill currently in the legislature, would establish a committee to study adequacy. So I would encourage everybody on the webinar today to stay in touch with what's happening with HB 356, because that is an opportunity for New Hampshire to rethink how we define and fund adequacy. So another question is, what happens if a community, if their statewide education property tax exceeds the cost of education, what happens to those dollars?
So those funds are kept locally by the district. So they can use that to pay for their education costs right there in their local schools. If you remember, even through probably the statewide education property tax alone, a town is probably very rarely raising the full cost of an adequate education, or raising the full cost of an education. So they are having to incur some local property taxes too. So in theory, I guess if they raise more than the cost of an adequate education alone through the statewide education property tax, then that could then reduce some of the local education property tax that's required for the district to raise.
So there's a question about how is catastrophic aid calculated? So it's a great question, and Reaching Higher is actually putting together a brief on special education in New Hampshire, because there's a lot of details that are important here. But basically,
So catastrophic aid funding, for all of you that don't know what that is, so it's funding that's provided by the state of New Hampshire in the general fund for very high cost special education kids. So these are kids that typically cost $100,000 or more a year. And there's a formula that's in law, and the way that formula works is that any costs that exceed a cap, the cap is 3.5 times the average cost per pupil, which is that amount, the $14,000. So 3.5 times that, so about $50,000. Any costs that exceed that $50,000 are eligible for reimbursement at 80% of the of 80% of that amount through the state of New Hampshire. So we calculate the costs above that cap, that 80%, and we then look at the appropriation that we have in the state budget, and we say, all right, well, each town has this amount of costs, and then we prorate that because we don't have enough appropriation in our budget to pay that full 80% of the amount above the cap. It's actually fairly complicated calculation, so I think Dan said, we can get into that a little bit more.
Yeah, Reaching Higher will be providing a more comprehensive brief on that, because special education is, hugely impactful for many families across our state, and we want to ensure that we provide a very thorough description of how this works and kind of what the funding streams look like. But services can range from a number of things, talking not just about additional personnel in a school, but also perhaps unique services that allow the student to engage in educational content that they otherwise would not be able to do so. So another question about the New Hampshire retirement system, and it's a great question, and there is a bill going through the legislature. I don't have the number of the bill in front of me right now, but it would increase, I think, the state contribution to 15% for teachers, members of the police, and fire, and members of fire departments across the state. So happy to track down that bill number if you want to follow up and send you some more information about that specific legislation. Okay, question, there has never been a cap on the amount of property taxes that can be charged. So I think the question might be about local property taxes is my guess.
And some cities in New Hampshire do have property tax caps. So that is actually just a local decision. Right.
And someone just told us, hey, HB 413 is a bill that talks about increasing the state contribution towards retirement funds. So HB 413, encourage everybody to go and track that down, and it's moving through the legislature right now. Another question is, when was the last time the state hit the full 80% for catastrophic aid? That's a great question. We will definitely answer.
I believe the last time was actually 2010. It was 2010, possibly 2009, but it hasn't been in the last 5 years.
So a couple other questions around comparing New Hampshire to other states like Vermont or Maine. So it's a little tough because other states do calculations differently, and it also depends on whether or not you include SWEPT in the state funding, because realistically it is a local contribution, not necessarily a state revenue source. But even if we include SWEPT, I believe that New Hampshire still ranks below most states in how it supports public education. Our state contribution is among the lowest in the country. And it's also, our spending is among the highest. So our communities are obviously investing a lot in education. Our state is contributing a relatively small amount compared to what it looks like in other places across the country. So a question, So SWEPT, why is it called state aid? It's a great question, and I think that it basically is that the state does determine the amount, and so as for an accounting perspective, it is money that comes into the state and then leaves the state. So on the state's books, it would factor both as a revenue and an expense. What is the current percentage of catastrophic aid provided? That's a great.
So the current is the 72% of the 80% of costs above the cap. So really, what that looks like is if a district is spending $100,000 on a kid, the district is receiving about $30,000, and from the state of New Hampshire, and the district is paying all of the other remaining costs. And these are costs that are just special education costs alone.
The question, like, what is racing and charitable gaming?
It's a department that's one of the state of New Hampshire departments, no different than the lottery that we raise revenue sources from.
So there's a question, do charter schools receive more state funds per pupil than public schools?
If you're looking at just state funds alone, the answer is yes. If you're just looking at that base cost alone, then the average public school is receiving in this year $3,561, where the charter school is receiving $6,500 and some change. So if you're just looking at state dollars to state dollars, yes, a charter school is receiving more. However, there are a myriad of other resources that a district school can receive funding from that a charter school cannot. Most notably, that's the local tax dollars, so the local property tax dollars that a district school exists on or runs on. The charter schools don't receive that funding.
So we're coming down to the last couple of minutes. We'll try and answer as many questions as we can. Another question, on the last slide, is there a carve out for property, plant, and equipment? So I think that they mean this slide. And so this slide does not demarcate what is essentially facilities cost. The state does track capital items and bonds payments that are related to education, but I don't think the state has a detailed database on like maintenance costs, for example. I think that gets bracketed into operating expenses for schools. Oh, I see. So I'm sorry. And that question that they just sent another question is actually the student graphic. So our adequacy student.
So that's the building costs.
Yeah.
So one thing that's, I guess, important to point out about adequate education funding is that you're right. You don't see building costs in here. You see facility operations and maintenance, but you don't see actual costs of building a building or really operating a building. So these costs, when the adequate education formula was determined, were intentionally left out of this calculation because there was another pot of funding that the state provided funding for districts to build and renovate new buildings. That money is that building aid money that we have mentioned that there has since been a moratorium placed on that money. But you're right, renovating buildings is not in the student cost because of that building aid pot of money.
So there's a question, is the voucher program independent of all funding, or does it come from the pool of business contributions? So New Hampshire has an education tax credit program, and Reaching Higher, there is a policy brief on our website about this, but in essence, it's like businesses that contribute to qualified scholarship organizations, and there are 2 qualified scholarship organizations in New Hampshire. Businesses can receive a tax credit against their business profit tax and business enterprise tax that they owe to the state. So though I don't know whether I don't think the provisions of that law talk about whether those go towards education trust fund or general fund, but in essence, they're getting a tax credit against the BPT and the BET, both of which go into the education trust fund and the general fund. So there are a couple other questions that I'm going to send a note to because it would be great to follow up, but wanted to thank everybody for participating today. As I mentioned earlier, we are going to be posting this online, the presentation and the recording, so we hope that you can go and find it after this. And as always, please send us an email or reach out in however you want to. We'd love to follow up. We're happy to do in-person presentations to communities and talk about this with audiences across the state. So thanks everybody again, and have a great day.